We've introduced Kierkegaard's Knight of Faith, and we've been given the example of a commoner who has fallen in love with a noble woman, but whose love, of course, is impossible. And where the commoner, now serving as an example of the Knight of Faith, has entirely given up on the impossible pursuit, and yet somehow, because still it is the most important thing to him, made a further movement, the act of faith, where he was able to make the impossible possible, but possible on another level. So that he was able to somehow be certain of having the noble woman's love, while at the same time he had lost interest in the actual existence of this noble woman. The impossible had become true without having been concretized somehow. Kierkegaard gives us another example of the Knight of Faith. In fact, he gives us many examples throughout the book, apart from Abraham himself, of course. He gives us one example which I like because I think it might be most relevant to us. Because again, Kierkegaard is only interested in Abraham as an example of the Knight of Faith, where the Knight of Faith has to be a possibility, though maybe a very mysterious possibility of my own existence. And so this example, this next example, I like because more even than the example of the commoner's love for the noblewoman is a very pedestrian example. In fact, that's the whole point of the example. Kierkegaard says he has never met a knight of faith. He says he himself has no idea how the movement of faith, the act of faith, is to be made, that he cannot understand it. And he says he has never met a knight of faith. But that if he ever met one, he couldn't know that he had met one. He says, I imagine a knight of faith would seem quite normal. He says, imagine someone on his way home from work who somehow is convinced, knows for certain that his wife at home has made a very nice dinner, which he knows is waiting for him at home. And yet, imagine that this very normal looking fellow is actually quite poor. And in fact, it is materially quite impossible for his wife to have acquired whatever is required for the fancy meal that he imagines. And somehow, he is certain that he will have uh, this nice dinner. And when he comes home, and of course the nice dinner is not there, and there is very little to eat, still he doesn't mind. It is all the same to him. The Knight of Faith somehow has reconciled the what is impossible, what is impossible in this world, and what is spiritually, one might say, what spiritually is um, necessary. Of course, if this person coming home from work, being so certain that there would be this very nice meal waiting for him at home, were to um, mention that to someone else, and then it turned out, of course, that there was no such fancy meal, then this other person who had been told about the fancy meal would be quite right to charge the Knight of Faith um, uh, charge him with the crime of lying. Just as we are very right to charge Abraham with the crime of murdering his own son. And then this again hangs on the fact that this final movement, the movement which makes the Night of Faith, is personal, perfectly personal, private, as opposed to the glorious movement made by the hero, which has, in some sense, to be publicly recognized, or at least publicly recognizable, admirable. Because a hero, after having sacrificed his own interest, then equates his interest, his desire, with whatever greater duty he has um, to engage in. And this can be understood because it's greater duty, this project of the hero, which would provide the context for the heroic deeds, can be understood, can be shared. But this is not the case with the Knight of Faith, because the Knight of Faith, after having resigned, in the case of Abraham, the life of his own son, or in the case of the commoner, the actual possibility of obtaining the noblewoman's love. After having made the movement of resignation, makes a different movement, which really cannot be understood, which in fact has to be observed, which somehow brings together mm, the worldly and the otherworldly, the finite and the infinite. Now I have this quote on the screen because it's important to understand that in Kierkegaard's language, this whole act of faith is not an aesthetic experience. Kierkegaard says it's true that the aesthetic movement is subjective, we want to say, individual, situated. And in that way, it resembles the act of faith. But the aesthetic movement is the one that actually precedes the ethical movement, which is the movement of resignation, or at least begins with the movement of resignations, which we talked about previously. After having resigned the individual for the sake of the universal, which is the ethical movement, which is the movement um, that comes after or is beyond the aesthetic movement. After having done this, though, there is a further movement, the movement of faith. And in this movement of faith, the individual gains back his importance. In fact, it is a moment. It is the moment where, or the act where, the individual realizes the what Kierkegaard calls the eternal validity of the individual, where suddenly the personal experience, through its relationship with the eternal, the absolute. The answer to our first question, of course, which was, how is Abraham to be admired even though he killed or was willing to kill his own son? Was that apart from being a murderer, he was also faithful. Something that we are able to understand about Abraham, and which gives us a hint to the fact that he is not simply a murderer is that he never stopped. He never stopped wanting his son Isaac to be alive. He never stopped loving his son, and his son never stopped being the most important thing in the whole world to him. And yet he murdered his son in the name of something somehow greater than the finite, than his own situation. But Abraham had to be silent. Abraham had to be silent such a way that um, it is impossible for the hero to be silent. Abraham is silent because he cannot explain, he cannot himself understand why he has to do what he has to do. There is no sense to faith, and so of course what faith demands is cannot be explained. Now, this is not to say, it's not to say that faith is the absence of doubt. Just as we've seen in the biblical quote from which the title of Kierkegaard's book, Fear and Trembling, is taken. Faith is the absence of hesitation. Faith is a resolution, but it is not the absence of doubt. It is not the absence of fright. It is not the absence of anxiety. In fact, faith has to be experienced with fear and trembling. Abraham, while he was um, walking his son to Mount Moriah, was torn between the demands of the world and the demands of God. Abraham's silence, his inability to speak, is explained, as we've just said, by the fact that he doesn't have reasons for what he does, that there is nothing that he could say about his project that could be understood. In fact, strictly speaking, he doesn't have a project. And we remember that this is also why Abraham cannot be a hero. His actions cannot be great if we do not understand why. And really, there is no why, there is no sense to it. And this also means that Abraham himself cannot explain to himself even what he is doing or why he is doing it. And so before him, he has this divine order, which makes no sense but seems like the most important thing. Under some perspective, the religious perspective, we might want to say. But then there's this terrestrial perspective also, which doesn't understand or cannot understand the value of that supposed divine order, but can very well understand the value of his son's own life. And so there is a doubt. And this is important. Kierkegaard's Knight of Faith is a doubter of the highest degree, Kierkegaard said. There is no hesitation. There is no murmurings or disputings, as we've read in that Pauline quote earlier. Abraham is resolute. He does not when walking with Isaac to Mount Moriah, he doesn't sometimes turn back. His steps always go forward, but every step is difficult, and every step he has to choose the religious perspective rather than the worldly one. Abraham doubts, he is torn. And this also, and perhaps gives us the first thing that could be more frankly admired about Abraham, is that this requires courage. Of course, the courage of his resolution, the courage of jumping into the abyss, if we could call it that, without any sort of guarantees, without even a goal or a possible reward. But then again, this resolution of his might seem admirable when we put it this way. When we remember what it brings him to do, i.e., killing his own son, a project which we cannot understand, then even this, I think, is very hard to admire. We might admire, for instance, Jeanne d'Arc, which we talked about earlier, her courage in the face of impossible odds. But we could understand why she was doing this. We could understand at least what would come out of it, what good would come out of it. But in this case, we cannot. And finally, and this is, of course, very closely related to Abraham's doubting and his silence. Abraham also is anxious. And Sartre earlier was right to say that Kierkegaard ascribes anxiety, anguish to Abraham. This is, of course, true. But unlike the way Sartre put it, it is not, Abraham's anguish is not the common anguish of being faced with an alternative and having to choose, having to assume our own freedom. It's more than this. It's, in the case of Abraham here, it is the anguish of having to choose between two very different perspectives, two, I might almost say, two levels of existence, or two levels of existential possibilities. In a sense, it would be possible. It would be possible. Of course, it would be possible. Otherwise, Abraham um, really would mean nothing if it wasn't possible for him. Existentially speaking, he would mean nothing if it wasn't possible for him to choose the worldly perspective in the end, to 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 kneel down and say to God that he doesn't have the strength, and that uh, God must choose someone else as his name. God must choose someone else as his knight, and that he will not sacrifice his son Isaac. Of course, that is possible. And so, again, Abraham is always torn between the religious and the ethical or the worldly perspective. Always, if he chooses a religious perspective, he will hurt. Aesthetically speaking, ethically speaking, he will, he will be hurting, killing his son. It is against his duty, and it is also against what he finds beautiful, what he loves. But if he were to choose the worldly option instead, then his failure in in the face of the absolute would also mortify him. In the Kierkegaard's retelling of the story of Abraham, after Isaac is saved, Abraham continues to be depressed, or perhaps enter a new kind of depression, which is in the anguish that we were talking about earlier. And this is strange, but so for Kierkegaard, we had to forget in the whole story of Abraham, we had to forget what came before this, uh, before the divine order to sacrifice Isaac. And we also have to forget what happens afterwards, what happens even at the end of that story, that Isaac is saved, because we need to remember that Abraham didn't know that Isaac would be saved, and that Abraham was fully ready and almost did, even drew the knife that was ready to kill his son. We must forget the happy ending. But really, even if we bring that back in the story, Kierkegaard shows us, or wants to show us, still for Abraham, it is not a happy ending. In a sense, he has been betrayed there by God. Because at the end, when a goat is sacrificed instead of Isaac, and a new covenant is sealed, and the people of Abraham uh, now understand what happened and rejoice, and now understand that Abraham is the chosen one, etc. And Abraham goes on to Abraham's descendants go on. Well, Abraham continues to live and go through all sorts of glories, live until he's very very old, and his people become, well, are the chosen people. All this doesn't comfort Kierkegaard's Abraham, because all of this makes of him a hero in the classical sense. Suddenly, Abraham is a hero again. He is understood um, he is understood by the people around him. He is understood by the world, by the public. His position makes sense, can be explained, and what he did had a reason, and now he is rewarded as a good hero should be. But that also means that suddenly he is not a knight of faith anymore. I don't know if the analogy is um, great, but we can think of it as when a friend whom we love dearly asks of us some favor, which we are very happy to, which we are very happy to give him, even if it costs us something. What if our friend suddenly at the last minute were to say, "Oh, never mind, you don't need to do this for me," for whatever reason? If you're only doing this out of ethical duty, then you are relieved. But if really this was a moment, if this really was the opportunity for you to um, enter or show or experience this relationship of love that you have, then the fact that you don't have to do this favor anymore suddenly becomes a disappointment. In a sense, Kierkegaard's Abraham missed his chance there. He was suddenly brought back when Isaac was saved, he suddenly was brought back, jerked down to back to the level of the world. I guess you could say. So of course, the this worldly part of him, this perspective that he did not choose, and that's what made him a knight of faith. This perspective that he did not choose has to rejoice. Isaac is alive, but in that higher perspective, in the face of the eternal, he's lost everything. And this Isaac, which he was supposed to gain back at that higher level, whatever that means, well, he doesn't get that. And so, in a sense, in a Kierkegaardian sense, we have to say, despite the way the story is told in the Bible, we have to say that in the end, Abraham was a failure.